I'm a senior lecturer in urban planning at the University of Liverpool. So I'm a planner.
So your Decarbonate project was called Co-Designing the 15-Minute City. Can you just explain to everyone what a 15-minute city actually is?
Yeah, so the 15-minute city idea, it's been sort of getting some press at the minute as well. And it's a relatively simple concept at its heart. It's the idea that from where you live, or from in its truest form, anywhere where you are in the city, all the sorts of things that you might need to live your daily life. So shops, schools, doctors, places of worship, parks, whatever it might be, are a 15-minute walk from that point. So the starter point now is normally from where you live. But it could, in its truest form, it could be anywhere. So the idea that the city doesn't exist in isolation, but it's a 15-minute walk. That's the basic concept.
What are perhaps the benefits and the disadvantages of a 15-minute city?
So I think the benefits of it are, it's intended to make places livable, to make them walkable, so that you don't have to drive. No, and within this, no one's saying that you can't drive or shouldn't drive, but the idea to sort of enable people to drive less, because you don't have to drive to a big supermarket, or you don't have to drive to the doctor's surgery. That's the benefit, and then all the kind of the associated benefits that come with that in terms of quieter streets, lower pollution, better air quality, better health, all of that kind of thing. I think the disbenefits, I mean, the nature of it is that it's a catch-all sort of policy. It doesn't necessarily work that well in all places. There's sort of relatively fair criticism about how this translates from cities to towns, particularly to kind of rural areas and villages, where in some cases a 15-minute drive might be a reasonable standard for service delivery. In terms of just societal understanding of it, I think that's probably one of the challenges that it's facing at the minute.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful point. So that kind of disconnect almost between people perhaps wanting to prioritize cars still. I still think we have an element of that in a lot of places and cities, and therefore going, are you stopping me doing that with this 15-minute city idea?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. I think that's the real root of a lot of that kind of discussion. And whether I'd be popular or not for saying it, I think there's a real root in the kind of NIMBY type movement that you see in a lot of other cases, where nobody deep down wants to admit, I don't want to do this because it's inconvenient to me and I don't like it. So they'll come up with another sort of slightly tangential excuse for why it's a bad thing, because they don't want to say that the elephant in the room of, I don't like this because I want to drive my car wherever I want. And the thing I always kind of latch onto that I quite like as a kind of principle is when you look at places like Copenhagen, where they've done it, and they've been doing it for 20, 30 years, but their principles are, you can still drive wherever you want in Copenhagen. If you want to drive, you can. There's just an expectation now that you just have to share with everybody else, and there's a different kind of hierarchy. What you see constantly, if you look at any of these sort of controversial sort of schemes, so if you were to go to like Waltham Forest now, which was one of the ones where 10 years ago they held like a mock funeral for like the death of the high street, because they thought that what they're doing there is gonna kill all the shops. I bet if you went to Waltham Forest now and said, we'll take it all out, absolutely not. It's brilliant. It's better. And I think you see that as well. I understand like people are sort of afraid of change, but I think sometimes when that change happens to them and then they go, oh, actually, you know what? I was frightened of it, but it's actually made my life better. And I think that there will be a significant element of those things when people realize, oh, my street's a bit quieter. Oh, my kids can play outside the house again and stuff like that. And then you went, do you want cars back? Like, oh, absolutely not.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting just letting people experience it and see what that transition looks like. So I wonder if you could just talk us through a little bit on what your seed corn project did. What did you get up to in it, and how were you trying to look at these kind of issues of decarbonisation?
Yeah, sure. So I think part of the idea of the project came out of the exact issues that we've just been talking about. To be honest, when we put the funding in, we were watching low traffic neighbourhoods going in, particularly in London, I think Oxford as well. And what we were seeing is people, we're talking about the kind of the sort of NIMBY argument, but a lot of the opposition that was coming up, I think semi-legitimately, was that we weren't consulted on these schemes. They were imposed on us. Local authorities that had, admittedly that they had funding that they just had to get out the door really, really quickly. And to do that, they basically had to bypass consultation and did things. So we were sort of, I don't know if inspired is the right word, but we were sort of like watching this, and the thought was, how do you sort of turn that on its head? How do you actually sort of respond to some of those issues? And we at the time were talking with our project partners in John Moores, who for a long time they've had sensors up on bike lanes, and what they do is they, it's literally like counter that monitors how many bikes, cars, speed, time of day, and they look at things like how it's affected by weather, how it's affected by whether it's cold or times of day and all that kind of thing. What we thought was, it'd probably be nice if you could sort of understand what happens on a street first and go to the people who live there and say, this is the reality of your street. This is what it looks like. Put a sensor up for in the end it was 6 months, to gather some data. What does it look like? So you go, you do realise that X number of cars go down your street in this hour-long period and so on, and then say, well, what do you think about that? And armed with that information, so I think one of the legitimate criticisms of a lot of these schemes is they just did it. But armed with that information, what do you think should happen? Are you happy with the status quo? You're all right with that? Do you want interventions? Do you want less cars? But then the idea was to try and sort of see how well you could design projects with the people who live on the street. And the kind of core principle of it is, it's their street. They live there. So, I think one of the legitimate criticisms that can be leveled at a lot of councils is stuff happens and it's designed by a traffic engineer somewhere, and then you get the consultation. Then you see the drawings. So it's trying to flip that on its head and saying, oh, actually, the people on the street would love a bike lane, or would love a zebra crossing, or would they're fine with it. Leave it be. They're all right with that. And that way, if you've designed it, then when you get to the consultation phase, hopefully you might get those residents saying, that's what we wanted, thank you very much. And I think the thing that I thought was really surprising is when we did talk to people on that street, how in tune they actually were with the reality of their street. Like really, really in tune, to the point where one of the people we were talking to said something like, oh, after 5 o'clock, it's about one car every minute goes past the house. And then when you look at the traffic data, like it was average like 58 cars in an hour.
Wow.
Almost like in really freakishly accurate things. And I think it's that. So I think one of the main conclusions is you kind of overlook it, but like people know their patch, people know their street, the people who live there, funnily enough, know more about it than you, about what the reality is. And I think that can get lost, I think, in consultation, because it's sometimes the old planners know best. But I think when people are telling you this is an issue, it's like, oh, actually, you know what, the data bears that out. Yeah. They were like really responsive to that data as well. They're really interested in it. They were kind of really interested in seeing it. And some was like, oh yeah, that's what we know. But like, oh wow, that's interesting. So people they cared. I mean it's again, it's almost a sort of an obvious statement, but they really kind of cared about where they lived and what was going on in their area. One thing we found is the people we talked to were probably quite ready for interventions on the road. I think one thing we did is we created like CGI renders of their street and use that to then model potential innovations. So it's not just like how would you feel about a zebra crossing? It's like, if we put a zebra crossing there and that's your house there on the CGI render, how does that make you feel? Yeah. And they were really open to those kind of ideas. I think they were really kind of receptive in a way that actually kind of surprised me. I think I'm cautious. It's easy to do that in the abstract. How those people would feel about that then if you actually did
Really
it
did
on their
it.
street, and they were affected by the ability to drive and that kind of thing. And I was surprised. I think when you kind of front load that consultation and people are involved in it, I think that was, I think people are more ready and more open to those ideas than you think. And I think part of the problem these things are facing is that people just have change imposed on them, and then they don't like that because quite often it's not perfect, or it's like, that's not quite what I wanted. Whereas if you've got more of that say, it's much harder to argue against objective data that's not, I don't like it, or it feels busy. And that's not to say those kind of subjective things aren't valid opinions, but it's really black and white stark data that was, I think, really valuable. I think one of the things we want to try and do with this is try and scale it up, because having that data is just so useful. I think in terms of trying to make the case for an intervention as well, it's just such a core of trying to achieve that.
Yeah, I guess if you've got sensors across a city, you're then in a position to go, well, actually, these areas are seeing the most traffic flow, or these areas are exceeding that speed limit, and therefore maybe we're prioritizing those for intervention first because we think that's where the biggest problems are.
Yeah, and I think one thing we saw with the sensors, for example, is that on the city council intervention site, I think it was something like 98% of cars broke the speed limit. It was a huge amount, and admittedly, not many of those were breaking 30. But it was something like 98% of cars. It was, a stunningly high amount. So you can go to the council and say, as much as this is about traffic calming, you need to do more interventions. In practice, it's the sensors that open the door to then engaging with the local authority, because you've then got something that they really, because they're obliged to do their consultation. They'll do it anyway, and they'll do it to their statutory levels. But data all of a sudden makes you sort of a valuable asset to them, and quite often they haven't got the capacity to monitor it, to understand it, to analyze it. And I think that's where that was really useful. I think that's the thing that really enabled us to do, is to provide that sort of window into that.
Where are you thinking of taking this research next? What are your next steps?
So I think our next priority is we were going to try and scale this up into a bigger sort of EPSRC type bid. I think that the nature of when we were getting to it, I think it's going to hopefully start those conversations like nowish, really. We talked about kind of spring of this year. But I think the idea is to try and work with the city region, particularly, to see how we expand this. So we did it in one neighbourhood on 2 streets, but looking at how you can do that strategically. So thinking about sensors going up maybe in advance of a proposed intervention for 6 months, and monitoring that, working with the community with that data, that they've got an interest in that when they found out we got sensors, they were like really interested. So I think this was designed as like a proof of concept. It was designed to test if we could work together as well. We'd never really done that kind of mix of the data driven work that John Moore's do and the kind of social sciencey plan and things that we do at Liverpool. And it did work. I think it showed that there was a utility in it. It showed that that as a team we worked quite well together. And I think if it didn't work, there was almost a recognition of like, well, we've tried it and we might modify it. But I think it did work. I think it so I think that's the next plan.